Thanks for coming out. I'm really glad to be able to have my friends on stage. It's always fun to have your friends on stage. This is so
It's
nice.
always fun to be with your friends on stage.
I know. I'm going to introduce my friend, Gary Marcus, Professor Gary Marcus. He's a cognitive scientist and best-selling author and professor emeritus at NYU. Gary is also CEO and founder of Robust.ai. Is that a new dot that you invented?
I did not invent the dot.
It's the dot real? Like I can get Janna.ai?
It's a new domain name. Yeah,
it's a new domain name?
Actually, the joke in venture capital was that if you put .ai in your domain name, you got like an extra $1 million of funding.
Oh my God, I don't even have my first million. This is awesome. Gary is also CEO and founder of Geometric Intelligence, which was recently acquired by Uber, and his new book with Ernest Davis is called Rebooting AI, Building Machines We Can Trust. And let's thank Gary for showing up tonight. Woo!
Thank you.
Also, I have my good friend who just makes me happy just for being here is Cathy O'Neil, mathematician, data scientist, and also once blogger of mathbabe.org, which is just the best blog name ever. Cathy is a Harvard-educated PhD. She taught at MIT and also was my colleague at Columbia and Barnard in the math department, and has done very interesting things, including a new startup called Orca, where she's CEO and founder. And as we say, if you fuck up your algorithm, call Orca. Cathy is also the best-selling author of the National Book Award-nominated Weapons of Math Destruction. And you're going to help me with the subtitle, because it's a really beautiful, I usually skip subtitles, but I think yours is really important. Can you tell us the subtitle?
How Big Data Increases Inequality and Threatens Democracy.
Yeah, so it does. Thank you, Cathy.
Thank you for having me.
Here. And also, just so you're prepared, we're doing something a little different this time. We're going to talk like Sci-Con, like we always do, in our kind of extemporaneous way, and then we're going to do lightning rounds with the amazing poker player Annie Duke, with the computer scientist Pedro Domingos, and with the Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman. So yeah, not bad. So I don't care how hot it is. I don't care how hot you are. Just like stay in your seats. Okay, what are we doing? I want to talk to you about fear-mongering, and I want to start with you, Gary. So there's a lot of fear-mongering about AI. I mean, Elon Musk, who is a technophile, right, has taught us to love technology, is telling us the existential threat from AI is more insidious and graver than the existential threat from nuclear weapons. I mean, that's not a comforting sentence to land on one's ear. But you seem to be thinking, it's not a big deal.
Well, certainly in the short term, it's not a big deal at all. Mm-hmm. I have a lot of riffs about this in the book that I co-wrote with Ernie Davis. One of them is all this worry about existential risk is sort of like being in the Middle Ages worrying about traffic accidents on highways when you really should have been worrying about good hygiene. So the problems are really more immediate, the ones that we need to worry about now, using AI in lots of ways that are biased, for example. I'm sure Cathy will talk about it a lot, or using AI in driverless cars when it's really not ready to do it and it's dangerous. These existential risks are very far away. There's another riff in the book which is about what to do if the robots attack. And at least right now, what you can do if the robots attack is something like close your door. Like, robots are not very good at opening doorknobs. If that doesn't work, maybe you can lock the door. So there's a data set now they can practice opening doors, but there's no data set for unlocking doors. And if you had to jiggle the handle, like, forget it. So there's not a lot of short-term worry about the robots. And there's one other point, which is that AI has gotten a lot better in some ways and not others. And there are advances in some things and changes in some things and not others. So, in 1970, machines played the game Go, which is the closest we have to a territory taking over kind of AI. And so that, that would be the big risk. And in 1970, the machines couldn't play the game at all. And now they're the world champions. And so you plot that and you say, oh my God, exponential risk. But then if you plotted their interest in human affairs, the top Go players, top Go machines in 1970, and now it's a flat line. There's no change. There's no interest. AlphaGo, the best Go machine in the world, has no interest. It doesn't even know that there is anything beyond the stones on the board.
Yeah, sometimes I think about how intelligent dolphins are, but for whatever reason, in their programming, they're not concerned with altering their environment. They're not trying to take over the earth. They're just like singing and talking and minding their own business.
And AlphaGo is just playing Go all day long, and it doesn't care about anything else.
So, Cathy, I wonder what your feeling is about that real existential threat, that whole singularity concept. I mean, I know you have concerns about even what's going on now, but what about, do you also think, I mean, think about the quantum physicists in the early part of the last century who thought quantum physics was innocuous. And there's even a line in the play Copenhagen where Bohr says to his wife, I don't think anyone's thought of a way to use quantum mechanics to kill people. And 10 years later, they're building a bomb. So what's your attitude about that?
Yeah, I guess I have two answers to that question. The first is that people who don't have very many problems worry about that kind of problem. You know, that's the first thing. It's like Elon Musk, what are his problems? It seems like traffic and not living forever.
Work-life balance.
Other people have real problems, and you know, it doesn't come on their list of the top 10 that, you know, that computers become self-conscious and want to kill us. It's just not, it's not immediate. The other thing, though, that I think is, you know, echoing what Gary was mentioning, is that we actually have problems now. We have real problems. And I'll just mention an article this morning came out about the crime risk scores that are being used in Kentucky to decide who deserves bail. It was meant to make judges less racist. And the result has been, when the addition of that crime risk score has been put into the judicial system, that the outcomes are actually more racist. And it turns out that essentially judges use the crime risk scores for white people but not black people. So in other words, we actually have problems. And the thing that we're not quite there yet, and this is an exception I just gave, really a wonderful, I'm glad we know it. The difference is that we do not see the dead bodies. So I'm just like, I know we're going to talk about self-driving cars tonight because it came up a lot in the book that I read. It's an excellent book. The thing about self-driving cars is it's the exception that proves the rule, right? Self-driving cars are the one technology where you actually see the dead bodies. Every time a self-driving car kills someone, it's a headline news. Right. But think about, and you can't really think about it, that's the problem, but imagine the results of all the job matchmaking platforms. I'm looking for a job. Can you give me a job? Well, people like you got jobs like this. And we're going to show you the jobs that people like you got in the past. We don't show you the jobs that we don't think people like you got. Yeah. Like, in other words, there's a lot of mistakes being made right now.
Right.
They're not maybe deaths. They're not deaths, but they're flaws. They're mistakes. Yeah. We're not even seeing them.
And so they're serious. They change people's lives.
They change people's lives.
Let's talk about what they are first and then talk about some of the consequences. So they are now mindless, let's agree, algorithms. Nobody is suggesting that there are machine minds, at least that most of us are aware of, maybe in some secret box.
Insert one thing there?
You may.
One of the reasons we wrote this book is because I think a lot of people treat AI as magic. They don't really understand that AI is just a set of algorithms, and some of them are good for some things and others are good for other things. The average person is just like, wow, AI magic, it's going to, you know, decide my judging sentences or something like that. And so there are a lot of people, I think, are actually deluded about the powers of AI.
But do you really think it's AI? Aren't we just talking about codes right now? I mean, there's no intelligence.
I mean, I absolutely think there's no intelligence there.
Yeah.
Part of the book is to try to really show the depth of the mindlessness that is in the system.
Right.
So, like, what happens when a machine tries to read something, how little it really understands.
Well, I understand you said if computers are so smart, why can't they read?
That's right. I have a piece in Wired yesterday that's adapted from the book. Yeah. And we have, we take the world's leading speech generator or text generation system, and we apply it to the reading of a children's story. So the first part of the Wired piece, we go through all of the things that a human being might do in reading the story, all the inferences they may need to make in order to figure out the blanks that aren't filled out. in that story, right? No good writer spells everything out because it would be incredibly tedious. And so the reader has to fill things in. So we fed this into OpenAI's GPT-2 system. And that system, some of you will know, is a system that OpenAI, let's just think about that name, Elon Musk's company, supposed to make all of its work open. They said, we made this thing and it is so cool, it is so amazing that it's dangerous and we won't release it, right? Like completely undermining the name of the organization. But eventually it sort of, people figured out how to replicate it. It wasn't that hard. And so we fed this children's story and it just completely didn't understand what's going on. It made grammatical sentences that continued the story.
Yeah.
You can look it up in the Wired thing. It looks like English, but it has nothing to do with what's actually going on. It recognizes that wallets are safe places, and then it thinks somebody put something in a safe place, not realizing that it's already in the wallet. It's just totally confused.
So it can't do what a child can do, which is fill in the gaps of knowledge, like you talk about. The gaps of information that can be extrapolated even by a 4-year-old.
That's right. It can't fill in the gaps, and it can't build an interpretation. So a 4-year-old reads a story, and they understand who did what to whom and why, and so forth.
So look at some of the failures. So talk to me about these failures. These are fails of the visual recognition system. So how many people, let's see hands, think this is a baseball? Okay, I know some of you are being shy. How many people think it's an espresso?
I take it we have no deep learning systems in the audience then.
What's the next one? What did a deep learning system think this was?
It said a refrigerator filled with lots of food and drinks, which should make you think of Oliver Sacks, the man who mistook his wife for a hat. Yeah. So, by the way, the system that did this, and this is typical, was on the front page of the New York Times as being a major breakthrough. Right. And they reported the successes for the system, but what's characteristic is they work some of the time, maybe 80% of the time, and the other 20% they look like they have brain lesions and should be rushed to the hospital.
Right, so like if it was Oliver Sacks, it would have been a deep learning AI with aphasia.
Exactly.
Yeah. What do we got here? How many people think it's a turtle, and how many people think it's a rifle?
Again, the deep learning systems seem to be sparse in the audience, and that's probably good, because they wouldn't understand what we're talking about.
So these are harmless errors that are just errors of us trying to assess what's going on.
Turtle and rifle might not be, though. I mean, that's part of the point.
Well, right, if it becomes an actual car or an actual...
If you have a security system that's looking out for rifles and it misidentifies a turtle and kills the turtle, it's not the best thing in the world. I mean, there are robotic vacuum cleaners that have been running over hedgehogs for a while. So I mean, these things do happen in the real world.
So, Cathy, talk to me about why you think that even these mindless algorithms are much more than comically faulty.
I mean, can we back up for a second and talk about, like, how much of this time are we going to talk about how much AI systems suck, and how much are we just going to make fun of Ray Kurzweil?
I don't...
We haven't done that yet, but we can get started.
I mean, that's kind of up to you.
And you know, all the other guys. Like, I just want to back up to this idea that AI can read. I got, like, this is just a pet peeve of mine, but like Ray Kurzweil was on this show with Neil deGrasse Tyson, and he was talking about how great AI is going to be in a few years when he can upload War and Peace, so he doesn't have to read War and Peace. It's just going to be 2 seconds, and then he's going to have War and Peace in his head. And for me, I was like...
And Woody Allen had a great line about speed reading War and Peace. He says, it's about some Russians. And that's kind of what AI systems can do right now.
Well, you know, Wheeler, the great American relativist, said space-time is what keeps everything from happening at once.
Yeah.
Like
I mean,
War and Peace.
Well, let me just riff on the Kurzweil comment, because on the one hand, I think at a sort of mathematical level, or even a philosophical level, it's just completely fucked up. But at the same time, I want to examine why do people buy this? You know, why are we into listening to that kind of bullshit? And so, starting with why it is philosophically uncentered, is like, I think he's really confusing, and I think you might agree with me, he's confusing information from understanding. So the idea that you could have an uploaded text accessible in your brain isn't so far. I mean, it's like, dude, we have that. It's Google.
Sure,
it's called Google, right? Or whatever. It's like, it's easy to imagine. But then the question is, what does it mean to understand War and Peace? Like, And my understanding of it, I think about when I read The Brothers Karamazov when I was 15, and I was like, Alyosha is the main character of this book. And then I read The Brothers Karamazov when I was 25, and obviously it was Ivan who was the main character. And then I read Brothers Karamazov when I was 35, and it was Dmitri who was the main character. And I'm going to read it again next year, and it's going to be the father, right? So the point is that it's like, it is an actual interaction with the text that means you've read a book. And so maybe what Kurzweil means is he wants that interaction to be embedded in his brain, which is already very generous as an understanding of what he was talking about. But if that is his understanding, then whose interpretation? Whose interpretation? Some like schlub like gets the official word on what it means to interpret War and Peace? Like, what is that? So that's my first point, which is that it actually makes no sense. The second point is, why do we fall for this? And my theory about it is, it's something about we love the idea of genius. We love the idea of like articulated crystalline genius that nobody can possibly touch. It is an idea, it's like a Platonic solid type of idea. It's like it doesn't actually exist, but we like to ascribe white men like Ray Kurzweil this property of genius so that we can just admire it from afar without ever actually testing it.
Gary, you looked like you were going to chime in. I felt like there was like an applause brewing in the audience.
I mean,
Do you want to pick on Ray too?
I'll pick on Ray too,
He
sure.
almost came tonight.
Since you asked, Ray's latest thing you can watch on TED in 2018, I guess, was something called Google Talk to Books. And it claimed that it could answer any of your questions. And what it did is a little bit like keyword search, but better. So keyword search, you'd ask a question and we'd find something that matches. And there's some clever tricks using something called word embeddings that he uses, but it still doesn't actually work. The headlines that came out were like, Google Talks to Books can answer any question about anything that it reads. And we typed in the course of writing our book, questions like, where did Harry Potter meet Hermione Granger? And it's in there, but it's not directly spelled out in a sentence, and the system can't infer what's not spelled out in a sentence. Or you can say, who was the oldest Supreme Court justice at a particular time? The information is all out there on the web, but the system can't actually assimilate anything. It's what I would call text processing rather than true comprehension. So you can match things, or you can do something a little bit more sophisticated than matching, but you can't do real understanding. Now, Cathy has a point that real understanding can be relevant to a person. If you go to literary theory, you'll hear about kind of the text and then the interpretations beyond. I'm just talking about the literal text. And what's obviously implied to anybody. Not even what were the emotions, but like, why did this person pick up this box? And it'd be totally obvious to a person. Machines just don't calculate yet. And I want to say, I'm not arguing that machines can't do this, and I think that's an important point we haven't made yet. I'm saying that the current technology can't, and that when we use current technology, we have to realize that it's so dumb that it can't read, and yet we're ascribing it pretty impressive powers, like the ability to drive safely in different kinds of weather conditions that might not be realistic.
Well, I don't want to be nitpicky, but I specifically made categories of like making fun of AI and making fun of Ray Kurzweil. And you said you were over here, but you just went back there.
I'm just going with the crowd here.
Before we make more fun of AI, I think that we're going to go on into hypothesizing about the future and what's possible and not being stuck in where we are now. But before we do that, I think it's really important to dig into your subtitle, which is about how algorithms can increase inequality in a really frightening feedback way and threaten democracy. And so I wanted to use this particular example that I've seen you use before. And can you tell us about this? Is it Bernard and Dylan?
Yeah, so this is a work by Julia Angwin from ProPublica. She's left ProPublica since then, but it was really seminal work. Yeah, she's amazing. So what she did was she looked at this crime risk score that was being used in Broward County, Florida, to help judges decide how long people should be sentenced to prison.
And this is about recidivism? Was that the main indication?
So it's an algorithm that predicts the likelihood of somebody being arrested within 2 years of leaving prison. I'm being really precise because if you think thoroughly about that target variable, being arrested within 2 years of leaving prison, you realize that there's lots of things that predict being arrested after leaving prison. And many of them have to do with where you live, whether you have a mental health problem, because we do not actually treat mental health problems in this country, whether you have an addiction, because we criminalize addiction in this country, whether you're poor, and whether you're a minority. And what she realized by looking at the data through FOIA requests, which were a pain in the ass, but Florida does have good, I'm allowed to swear here, right?
Oh, yeah. I think I opened with swearing, I'm pretty sure.
Florida has really good Freedom of Information Act laws, so that's where they were focused, and they found over their audit, I would call it an audit of the Compass crime risk score, that these guys in particular, the guy on the left had a much higher score than the guy on the right, even though he had much less of a criminal record.
So the higher score is worse.
The higher score is worse, and not only, it's worse because the judges are essentially incentivized to sentence you to longer.
Right, so I think, what did you say, he got a 10 out of 10?
He got a 10.
And the other...
And the other guy, Dylan, got
Bernard
a 4 out of 10.
On your left, got a 10 out of 10, and Dylan got a 3 or 4 out of 10.
Right.
And a 10 out of 10 is pretty much like give the guy the worst.
Yeah, give him
Sack
the worst
him.
sentence, yeah.
And you said that even though Bernard had a felony and they were both convicted of the same kind of drug possession.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, Dylan had the felony.
Right, the guy on the right.
And Bernard did not.
Right.
So is that what actually happened?
I mean, look, and these are guys, I'm glad that Julia found these guys, but the statistics that she found were not only did white people, white as men in particular, have much higher probability of getting lower risk scores, but they had much higher probability of getting lower risk scores even when they were coming back to prison.
Right.
And the converse was also true, that black men were twice as likely to get high risk scores even when they weren't being arrested. Mm-hmm. So that sort of, it's called a false positive rate. The false positive rate was twice as high for blacks as for white men. And so the point being this is a civil rights violation, right? You're over suspecting black men based on essentially profiling.
Yeah, but let's clarify. It's not that there is a racist person looking and deciding, I'm going to give this man a 10 and this one a 3. It's that the algorithm itself unintentionally started to feed back certain loops, like poverty, neighborhood, associations, friends.
Well, look,
and
there's
that
a couple
was sort of
things.
this inevitable thing. And then the more that those people got longer sentences, the more that it was sort of supporting, oh, look, they did in fact get longer sentences, so the algorithm's working, as opposed to saying, hey, this algorithm's deeply broken in a civil rights violation.
So there's so much to say, but I'll just try to synthesize it. Look, we know better than this. Yeah. We're humans. We know that police are charged with arresting people for being addicts or being poor, or having mental health problems. We know that. But the way we deal with the data around arrests is that we pretend that arrests are proxies for crime, and they are simply not. So the first mistake we made, which was an obvious mistake, was to say a perfect proxy for crime is the arrest record of the police. It's just, we know that's not true. And I've spoken to federal judges who decry these systems because what their problems are addiction. And they know that sentencing people to longer because they're addicts isn't going to help them. What they would like to do is to give them a rehab that works. But they just don't have that power. So I'm making the point that it's yes, you're right, that if we mindlessly pretend we are algorithms, if we pretend we are the paperclip example, which I hope we talk about, then yes, we could say this is creating a feedback loop that's going to make things worse and worse and worse. Yeah. But the truth is we should know better than that.
Yeah.
If I could make the point in a different way, a lot of the algorithms are fine, but the data are really lousy. And here's an example. You can type into Google image search, professor. Now, it turns out 41% of professors in the United States now are white males. But the result you'll get will be like 75%. And from a statistical standpoint, it's because there's not a random sampling here. It turns out that there are more white males that are labeled in the things that we would technically call a convenience sample that Google image search is using. Google image search isn't thinking in the way that a good scientist would about, is this a fair sample? Is it a representative sample? It's just taking whatever is there.
And
So
let's-
is this the right way of measuring arrests or measuring people's behavior? Well, no, people just tend to take whatever is there. They don't
Right.
think deeply about it. And the machine isn't even capable of thinking deeply about it. So it will reflect the existing data without realizing that society has changed or why this measure is incorrect. So good scientists can work those things through.
Right.
But the machines don't yet, again, I don't want to say AI will never work, but
Right.
the current machines that we're using don't have that level of comprehension to think about, like, what are the social dynamics by which this set of data were collected.
So let's talk, because this is a perfect segue into thinking about the character Tay, who was a Twitter digital AI.
Microsoft made it a chatbot.
Microsoft made it a chatbot, and if I'm not going to get it exactly right, I believe the Guardian headline was, "Millennial chatbot shut down within 16 hours of being turned on due to becoming a genocide-supporting racist."
True story.
She said something like, she tweeted something like, "I fucking hate feminists. They should all die and go to hell."
I mean, I'm not sure where the question there is, but it happened. And it's a great example, right? If you have a system that has no awareness of the nature of the data that it's working with, then it has nothing to do but go with the flow. So the same kind of system is used in China, in Shaoi's, where people are more careful about what they say in public, and it hasn't had these same kinds of problems.
Well, so let's talk about that, because Cathy talks about how algorithms are invested with our values, and here's an example of people with values that I don't think most of us really want represented, and the algorithms can't distinguish. And
the algorithm doesn't have any values.
Right. So let's talk more technically about the future. So big data has been a total breakthrough, because tell us what machine learning and these kinds of things, why they rely so much on big data, which means they ultimately rely on human beings. Can you talk us through that, how it's not just that they're independent learners, but they're actually learning from us?
I mean, there's a field called machine learning, which is part of artificial intelligence, and it's a field that's still evolving. And there are many techniques in it, and we will hopefully have many more techniques. It will get stronger and stronger. But the best techniques that we have right now rely on big data samples. Any technique is going to be better if you have more data than less data. So, the same reason a poll is better if you have more data in your poll. But what, say, children do when they learn about the world is they have a lot of background knowledge, so they can assimilate information relatively quickly. I like to give the example of when my daughter climbed through a chair. There was a gap between the bottom of the chair and the back of the chair. And she didn't need to have a million labeled examples. Like, you think about AlphaGo is the best Go player in the world. It played itself like 5 million times or 10 million times, and there was no cost to error except using a little bit of Google's server time. They have lots of it. So that system makes up for not having a lot of prior knowledge by just trying a lot of things out. My daughter didn't get 10,000 opportunities to climb through this chair. She got one, and she figured out how to do it because she had a model of how her body worked. I'm not saying it was conscious, but she's 5 years old at the time, or 4 years old at the time. But she had some unconscious model of how her body worked, about the physics of chairs, what an aperture is. She also had error correction routines. So her arm actually got stuck, and she wiggled around and got her arm climbing all the way through this chair. She didn't have a model. She'd never seen me do this. I'm afraid I'm too big to fit through the chair. Her older brother was a little bit too big to do it. And she'd never seen the Dukes of Hazzard where they climb through the car window, if anybody remembers that. She just invented for herself a goal and executed on it without having a lot of data, because she had learning algorithms that do things like calibrate her body relative to a situation. And that's more sophisticated than most of the algorithms we have now, which are kind of like blank slates and just trade off data for prior knowledge. And so they're very greedy for data.
I'm going to go, and that's all true, but I'm just going to also explain why the algorithms that we've been talking about fail, rather than like what they cannot do, like your daughter can, which is that they don't have the definition of success that is appropriate. So I don't want to dwell on the crime risk score, but like the crime risk score was trying to find out who was going to be arrested. And as I said, that's actually not a very difficult thought experiment to realize that would end up being super racist given our police practices, and classist for that matter. What we'd really like to ask is, what is the goal of prison? What is the goal of incarceration? And how do we build algorithms that work towards that goal? But we haven't had that conversation. So we haven't built those algorithms. And I'm not saying that it would be possible to build those algorithms, because maybe the goals that we actually care about are not quantifiable per se, but if they were, they'd be closer to things like public safety and rehabilitation and the continuation of thriving livelihoods than they would be to, do you get arrested within 2 years of leaving prison? So the point I'm trying to make is that if we are not optimizing to an appropriate goal, if we're instead optimizing to a very shitty proxy, we shouldn't be surprised when that proxy leads to all kinds of negative feedback loops. And we just simply don't have the wherewithal to actually build in the appropriate definitions of success in the algorithms, simply because, and this is my last point, algorithms pop up, in my experience, when we're trying to avoid a difficult conversation. That's why we'll have an algorithm that decides whether a teacher is good or not, instead of having a discussion about what makes a teacher a good teacher. We'll have an algorithm to decide who should go to prison longer, rather than deciding what is prison for. What's our goal for prison? We'll have an algorithm to decide who gets what job, rather than asking the question, what does it mean to be good at a job? Because it's easier to have those silly algorithms with shitty definitions of success than to have those difficult conversations.
I want to pick up on the first part of that. Can I get a show of hands? How many people have heard of Rosie the Robot? Is it everybody? Not that many, or I can't see that well in the crowd. So Rosie the Robot was a fictional robot in the TV show The Jetsons in the 1960s. And you can think back to the 50s and 60s. People had dreams of a lot of different things. One of them was chess computers, and another was domestic robots that could take care of the kids and the laundry and make dinner and so forth. And we made a lot of progress towards one, right? We have chess computers that are better than Garry Kasparov, and not that much on the other. So we have robots that can vacuum the floors. My co-founder of my new company helped invent those, and that's sort of the limit of it. Well, why is that? Well, one of the reasons is because things like chess have very well-defined goals. So it's easy to program a computer with the rules of chess. Whereas, first prerequisite to Rosie the Robot would be programming in something like, we could argue about the details, but something like Asimov's laws, to start with, first do no harm. And we don't know how to program in the notion of harm. It's a much more complicated and elusive notion. It's the kind of thing that Cathy is talking about. So there's a lot of work right now on something called reinforcement learning to make machines that basically just do trial and error learning for specific goals. And there's a lot of sophisticated work to make more and more complicated goals. But you can't program in a goal like do no harm unless you have a lot of prerequisites in place, like what a person is, what kinds of things could cause harm, and what biology is, and medicine, and psychological harm, and all of these things. And if we're just using statistics that are looking at like how often do two words co-occur, then we're not in a place yet to be able to code in a notion like harm or justice. And so the kind of paradox of the book of our book, Rebooting AI, that drove it forward is we're making advances in AI, but they're not what we think they are, and then we're putting them to work in the kinds of problems that Cathy is talking about.
And it's
premature. It's problematic and premature.
Yeah. So talking about robots, Gary, you sent me this. This is state-of-the-art robotics.
That's right. I usually like to show, actually, before this, a baby ibex climbing down a mountain.
Okay.
And the baby ibex is flawless. It doesn't make any mistakes. And then I say, in the interest of fairness, here's the robots.
Yeah.
And,
but the thing that I want to ask about is we're talking about AI, but we're not, it's not synonymous with robotics. Those are two different things, right? Robotics and AI could exist just in the internet, and it wouldn't actually have to have this human, anthropomorphic sort of realization.
Robots certainly don't have to be what we call humanoid robots, but one of the reasons that I recently founded a robot company is because I think it's where the rubber hits the road for making AI work. So there are a lot of problems, not all, and Cathy has a lot of good examples, but there are a lot of problems where you can settle for kind of decent performance. So if you build an advertisement, we should probably cut it off or no one will listen to me. You watch it like 3 or 4 times, it's more fun.
I trust my audience to be able to parallel process.
Disengage. So you can program an advertising recommendation engine, and it can be 75% correct, and you make a lot of money and nobody gets hurt. If it recommends books and it says, if you like Cathy's book, you'll like mine too, and you're wrong, you're out $30. It's not the end of the world.
Yeah.
But if you build a robotic system that is supposed to lift your grandpa into bed, and it works 95 times out of 100, that robotics company is going to go out of business. I mean, you can't afford to drop grandpa 5% of the time. So robotics is where your AI has to really be good. So part of robotics is building the hardware, and my company doesn't do that. But part of it is the software. That software is AI, and we're called robust AI. We're trying to make the software so that it works all the time and not just some of the time. And that's a real challenge. It requires taking AI to the next level in a way that advertising recommendation doesn't. And I pick on advertisement recommendation because it's the single biggest application of AI so far. There's a great line from Jeff Hammerbacher, who founded Cloudera and was one of the early engineers at Facebook. And he said, I'll paraphrase slightly, but he said, I saw the best minds of my generation selling advertisement. And that's a lot of what AI has been applied to.
But this video is what you said earlier, which is if you want to protect yourself during the robot invasion, paint your door black, put a doorknob on it, and maybe like really throw it off with a children's sticker, right?
Yeah,
and
or
then
in
you're pretty much
the
safe.
examples here, all of them were tried in simulation first.
Yeah.
Like people knew what the tasks were going to be in this challenge, they knew exactly what it was. But then they get in the real world and like the wind kind of throws them off. So like I didn't put in the book, but I should have added, have a portable fan with you. That'll probably knock them over.
I mean, I think this is the place where I probably disagree the most with Gary, which is
Wait for it.
I think the framing of robotics is moot, to be honest, because I feel like what worries me the most about AI, or whatever you want to call it, algorithms, is power. And the framing of robotics is, I own a robot. The robot is here to serve me. The robot may or may not successfully serve me. Whereas, like, normal people's reality is like, I applied for a credit card and I got denied and there's no explanation and it was unfair, but I don't know it. And the other people who also unfairly got denied the credit card also don't know it. So we can't unionize or we can't collectively organize and fight back. And so it's really about power, not so much about ownership. And that's the other thing about the Asimov's laws was like, do not harm humans. Well, like, wait, does that mean do not harm the owner of the algorithm? Because it's really all about who owns the fucking code. The people who own the code then deploy it on the other people. And there is no symmetry there. There's no way for people who didn't get credit card offers to say, ooh, I'm going to use my AI against the credit card company. It's like a totally asymmetrical power situation.
I'll say this. Maybe the single best compliment I've ever gotten is I asked Missy Cummings to be on the board of my company. I don't know if you know who she is, but she works on risk in robotics and driverless cars. She's testified to Congress many times. She's also an F-18A fighter pilot, which is pretty impressive. She did that before becoming an MIT professor and then moving to Duke. And I asked her to be on the board, and I gave her like 12 hours to decide because our website was going on. I mean, she could have said yes at any time. I would have taken her. But she said, I'm doing this because I trust that you actually care about these issues, and most people don't. But I'd written this piece in the New Yorker about exactly the example of, is the driver going to save driverless car going to save a person? I wrote this in 2012 before it was a popular example. I care about these issues a lot, and I am hoping that by working on the robots myself, I have some measure of control of it. And I do worry about what happens when the technology gets used more broadly. We talked about, are the robots going to take over the world? I don't think so, but I do think we should be worried about the misuse of robots, just like we should be worried about the misuse of AI. So I'm more worried about what bad actors will do with the robots than the robots suddenly developing a motivation.
Well, let's talk about, because we've been throwing around terms, robots, AI, and actually, I don't know if what we're really talking about is intelligence, or are we talking about consciousness? I mean, what are we really talking about? I think Cathy's point, are we trying to build gadgets to make our lives more convenient that we control? Or are we trying to invent a sentient being that's going to be conscious, in which case it would be ethically abhorrent to make it our gadget to make our lives better, right? So there is a sense in which we have to think ethically about what we're really doing, and also what do we really mean? Do we mean intelligence or do we mean consciousness?
So I'm not that interested in building robots with consciousness. I'm interested in building robots that can help people. And I think there's lots that a robot could do in principle without anything like consciousness. So you could build, for example, a robot that would rescue people in fires. You could build a robot that would take care of the elderly, which is important given the demographics of the world and fewer people to take care of more elderly people. And I don't think there's any need for consciousness. It's important for a robot to be able to build a representation of the world, to understand what the objects are, to be able to reason about the people that are in it, reason about the objects that are in it. That doesn't mean that it needs to have a kind of self-awareness other than like what its own body is doing and like, will I knock this over or not?
Would you intentionally block it if it was evolving its own sense of self and self-awareness?
I would organize
And
a
what
lot
does
of
that
conversations with a lot of really smart people to think really deeply about it. I don't think that it's anywhere near imminent.
I mean, would that be like lobotomizing a human to be like, oh my God, they're developing a
Well, I think
self-awareness and a
the
consciousness, I'm
argument-
going to nick it in the bud?
Yeah, I think the argument is you'd want to stop it before it happened if you made that choice. Or at least like either you make this choice now or you're not going to be able to make it later. And let's.
What do you think about consciousness and...
Yeah, I think it's, not only is it bullshit, but it's a dodge. It's a straight up dodge. People who talk about consciousness of AI are trying to avoid the fact that they are putting their values into the AI, and they don't want to deal with the consequences of it. So when we see Facebook optimizing to engagement, which then privileges fake news and outrageous anti-vaxxing crap, what are we doing? Well, what is Facebook doing? They are making what they call a sort of morally neutral choice, which is in fact not morally neutral. But instead of dealing with the fact that what they're doing is an ethical choice, is a values-laden choice, they start talking about how computers might have their own value system. I mean, it's actually ludicrous. And I think it is actually a dodge, and I think we should stop allowing it to happen. It's much less likely that will ever happen than what's already actually happening, which is that people are suffering algorithmic harm. They're not being told what's happening to them, and there is no appeal system. There's no accountability. That's much more direct, and it's happening. And you could think of it, if you want to, as a sort of super, like Silicon Valley level consciousness. You can think of it as an ethos, in fact, that has been embedded into our internet and into our credit system and into our insurance system. But it is actually humans that are using their algorithms in certain ways to make money.
I agree with a lot of what you just said, but so in particular, I really agree that Facebook is in a kind of moral dodge here, and that they're claiming neutrality that just does not exist. The part that I don't really agree with, or that I think we should be clearer about, is at least in the literature I know in philosophy, consciousness is more like feeling, what is it like to feel pain or to recognize the color red or to experience orgasm. And we have no idea whatsoever how to put those into machines. We can put values, I think, now into machines to some limited degree. So I think your conversation there is about values, and I think we need to work really hard on building better values into machines. And a lot of the book is actually about how to get enough common sense basis into the machines such that we can build those values. And I think that's an incredibly important mission. The consciousness stuff, getting the machine to know what it feels like to have orgasm, we don't need to work on that.
Okay, so, first of all, we do need to work on the orgasm question. That's a fact.
For independent reasons.
Am I right?
Over drinks, we'll talk about that part.
But I just want to say that I think our
21.
end goals are exactly the same. And like when I work with my clients at the algorithmic auditing firm, I don't say let's be morally neutral, because that's bullshit.
I agree with that.
I say, what are your values? Write them down. Let's ask questions of this algorithm to make sure they are consistent with your values. And don't try to pretend you don't have values.
And what I'm pushing towards is a set of machines that could actually see those values and act on them. And the gap right now is only the programmers can step in, and if they're sophisticated, realize that their algorithms aren't representing those values. And I think the world will be a better place when we have AI that can actually itself reason about those values, but there's a lot of prerequisites to getting there.
I know you're trying to go
please.
on,
No,
but I will
really,
say...
I don't need to go anywhere. I'm fine, I'm good.
The one thing I disagree with is it's not up to programmers. Programmers, fuck programmers. They already have way too much power. What we need is public conversations where the programmers and data scientists are translators, not deciders.
Well, we need both. So,
As you said, they're not arbiters of truth.
They're not arbiters of truth.
well, they certainly shouldn't be arbiters of ethics. But if they don't kind of get their stuff together, then we don't have a way of doing the translation.
We can't wait for them to get their stuff together.
Well, I mean, you know, what I wrote in the op-ed in the Times the other day is that we have a choice to make. I mean, we might want to restrict, at least for the time being, what we do with the machines because they're not up to it. You know, so it could be that the right decision is we are going to use less AI in the short term or circumscribe how we're going to use it until we can do these things properly. That's not a crazy decision.
I'm fine with that. Facial recognition, for example.
Yeah, so
It's a
this
good
is
example.
right on the topic of facial recognition. We're going to talk about deep fakes, which is also, to all your points, let's hear
Imagine this for a second. One man
what Zuckerberg has
with
to
total
say.
control of billions of people's stolen data, all their secrets, their lives, their futures. I owe it all to Spectre. Spectre showed me that whoever controls the data controls the future.
Okay, so
I saw it on the internet. It must be true.
it must be true. So that is the famous deep fake that came out and yet is reflecting what we're talking about, which is the divergence of values. I love
Total
this.
lack of values. The deep fake system has no values at all.
But
I mean,
also
there's
was
no...
putting into the mouths of the person the truth about the values of the system created.
So right now you have a system that anybody can put in anything they want into it, and those people can lack values, and the system doesn't have enough good sense to say, is this deep fake a reasonable one? Could it cause harm to humanity? Right? The system does not have that level of representation. Now, Cathy's also right that that doesn't mean the system is neutral. I mean, there's kind of no neutrality here, but the system is certainly unsophisticated about the kind of values you want. So you would like for a deep fake system essentially to have not a consciousness, but a conscience, and be able to say, is this a good thing for me to implement? But there's no code to do
Don't you think
that.
we're being naive to assume that, you know, you're an idealistic academic who was
Recently
after
retired.
knowledge recently, or prematurely retired. But don't you worry that, of course, there is no such thing as we've just discussed the trolls and the bullies and, you know, how Tay culled big data of real people saying racist and misogynist things. And so to presume that those good values will naturally emerge isn't that...
I don't think it's
Yeah.
that it's going to naturally emerge. I'd make a distinction between a world in which we could bring, for example, ethicists, lawyers, policymakers, together with programmers who did know how to implement the great thoughts that came out of these discussions, and a world where those ethicists could have all the discussions they want, and we have no freaking way to actually get the machine to understand it all. Right now we live in the former world. I think we would be better off, the latter world. I think we'd be better off if we could approach a world where intelligent people could work hard to figure out what the values are. And I'm not saying that's an easy task. So, you know, you can think about like the process of moral progress, and you can say, you know, we wouldn't want to have programmed into our machines the values that we had in 1600 when we all thought slavery was okay. So there's a lot of really hard problems to be solved there. But right now we don't even have the tools to work on the implementation side, the software side. So even if we had the kind of, you know, platonic ideal perfect set of values, we just wouldn't know how to begin to put in the machines. That's a problem. We need to work on both of those problems.
Yeah, and I feel like we're just coming full circle to my earlier point, which is that these AI systems have been deployed in order to avoid a difficult conversation. And what we're coming to is we need to have that difficult conversation. And guess what? It's not a math problem. It's a political problem. It's always been a political problem, and we need to have those political problems. And guess what? We're not going to agree. It's not about like being a good person. It's
So
actually
do you worry
politics.
about who to ask to be in that room and who decides
it's
who's
going to
in
be
that room?
that's the political discussion. That's the preliminary political discussion is
Who's in that room?
who's in the discussion, and then the discussion is. How do we balance the various trolley problems that end up being the ethical dilemmas within this problem?
No.
How do we balance the suffering of people who don't get hired from a job that they deserve with the suffering of the company that hires people that they don't actually want? That's never going to be resolved without like balancing harms, which is what ethics is really about. My point being that like this is not math. And it is, to agree with Gary, a technical problem that computer scientists do not care about yet, and have not started really working on, and instead we're giving computer scientists awards for doing faster, bigger data instead of asking harder questions.
I was about to disagree with Cathy, but she, I think, agreed with my point and extended it. So I was going to say it's not just a political problem. There is a technical problem, and she just acknowledged that. And people aren't really working on the technical problem. So around 3 or 4 years ago, people started having a lot of conferences about ethics in AI, which in itself is a good thing. But you go to these conferences and everybody sort of says, yeah, it'd be great if we had ethics in machines. But nobody's working on the technical problem of how you would do it. And so, I mean, we're agitated about two problems. I completely agree about the political problem. I wish more people would work on the technical problem, and I think it requires some important technical work first. We're absolutely going to need answers to both, and maybe we need to hold our horses on the software until we solve both problems.
Amazing. I want to thank, we're not leaving. Let's thank Gary and Cathy right before we go into our lightning round.
Thank you.
Cathy, you brought up earlier there's like some serious societal problems like lack of mental health care and lack of treatment for addiction. Given that the primary use right now of AI is dropping grandpa 5% of the time and selling me stuff, anyone can answer this. Is this the best use of the billions of dollars that go into funding this type of development?
Essentially AI being used for such greed and avarice. Would that be fair? An accumulation of the few.
I just, you know, I think you're talking about the crime risk scores and how.
Well, also advertisements and.
Also
things
advertisements.
Like that, and yeah.
Okay, well, I'm going to say something about the crime risk scores that I think needs to be said, which is that they're not evil. In fact, they're very, very interesting. But they're being used in a way that instead of acknowledging societal problems like we do not treat mental health, we do not treat addiction, we criminalize poverty, et cetera. Instead of addressing those problems, we shift the responsibility of those problems onto individuals and punish them for being in the wrong demographic profile. We don't have to do that. We could use the recidivism risk differential between people who are dubbed likely to have an addiction problem and poor minorities versus the people who have none of those properties. We could use that differential recidivism risk as a way of figuring out what kind of interventions would improve, would lower that gap. In other words, we could say, this is a reflection of what we're doing. How do we do better? So I just want to make it clear that I'm not saying that an algorithm is evil. I'm saying the algorithm is being used wrongly and used in an unethical way. So the question is, like, do I think it's a waste of money? It's certainly a waste of money if we ignore the potential for it being a mirror upon ourselves and us to do better. And that's what we're doing so far, but I have hope that we can do better.
Gary?
I think that there's an alignment problem. So most of the money going into AI research right now is going into corporations, and they're mostly, not entirely, interested in short-term profits. And so they pursue technologies that are here rather than technologies that might be more distant. It might take longer to pay off. And so some problems are getting neglected right now, like getting machines to read, which could really change science and medicine, but it's a hard problem, and so it's not one that corporate entities gravitate to. Even at Facebook and Google, for example, there's certainly some research in that direction, but there's also priorities on how do we make our search engine faster, or how do we make our news feed more attractive to people. And I have argued for, in a New York Times op-ed a couple of years ago, for something like a CERN for AI that would be a multinational collaboration with a specific goal, such as trying to build systems that read, because it's not a high priority in the corporate environment, and so I think the AI suffers to some degree for that.
Excellent. So do we have a second question here? Where's the mic? Whoever has a mic can start speaking, essentially.
Hello. Isn't it fundamentally kind of contradictory to, if AI is constantly, quote unquote, AI, a bunch of algorithms, constantly being patched up by people, and the argument is that people are flawed and can't do anything right, but the basic input is always going to be people doing it, why not just have people do it? Like, when is there, how do you know if a problem is actually, why not just,
I'll give you
if people are always evaluating it, why not just cut out the algorithm?
I'll give you an example that's less of a kind of hot trigger thing. People are bad drivers. when algorithms make mistakes in driving, we can correct them. Some of them are very subtle to correct, and to the extent that they rely on deep learning, they're not very interpretable, and we don't know how to do it. But in principle, there is certainly a lot of headroom to make algorithms that are much better than people. We know at what some people would call reflective equilibrium what good driving is like. So, that means we know in the abstract what good driving is. Sometimes humans make mistakes because they're drunk or they're checking their cell phones or something. But in that domain, we actually have a clear understanding of what effective driving would be. And so even though some individuals are fallible, the hope is that teams collectively can make things better, and they have. They haven't made them better as fast as I would like, and I think maybe the systems are being rushed out of the door prematurely, but we are making progress. We will continue to make progress, and in that domain, you don't get into the sort of more subtle political considerations. So it's certainly possible in principle. In terms of the ethical things, there are people that, for reasonably good reason, we trust that we might allow to make at least some of these things. I'm not saying that's an easy problem, and Cathy might want to jump in, but the fact that ordinary humans are sloppy in their reasoning doesn't mean that there aren't people who think carefully about different problems, like ethical problems, that we can't then program in the codification of what they think.
And I'll just echo that last point, which is that I actually think that the average data scientist engineer in Silicon Valley is a good person who wants to do a good job. I don't think people are like, I'm going to make this facial recognition software work much better on white men than black women.
Absolutely
That's
not.
a standard. What we need there is like standard questions that you have to answer, like to make sure that your algorithm works well enough to go into production. And you have to ask the question, the most obvious questions. Does it work worse for protected classes than non-protected classes? That's a question that we don't ask. And if we don't ask that question, then really stupid mistakes keep on being made over and over again. And it can be solved with simply better standards. So I just want to make it clear that I am not sort of imputing racist intention on any particular person. I'm just saying, look, we should know better by now. Let's do better.
And I'm going to come back to the technical point and totally agree with Cathy, but because I think the technical point is so important. Here's an example. Amazon tried to make an internal system for recommending job candidates, and they discovered pretty quickly that it was sexist. They weren't at all happy with that. They spent 4 years trying to make it better, decided that they never got it good enough, and they canceled the project. There, it's a technical problem. It's not an intention problem. They recognized that the system wasn't doing what they desired to do, and they also recognized that we don't yet have the technology.
So I'm really sorry for the short Q&A, and I'm really sorry to hog the last question, but I have to release everyone and let them enjoy the telescopes and the books. But I do want to have the last question and to ask first Cathy and then Gary. We've talked a lot about problems and not about solutions. And I mean, Cathy, you basically just weighed in on potential solutions, but what should we be doing from here? What is really what we should be looking forward and doing in the future? We're not going to stop the existence of algorithms. You're not going to stop companies like Google and Facebook from writing them. So what are we going to do?
Yeah, when I talk to policymakers about this, which I try to do, I always suggest that they think about important or critical junctures of human lives that are sort of informed by algorithms. So getting into college, getting a job, getting a loan, getting fired, voting, or political information in general. Many of those things already are regulated, and not to be like a total wonk, because I'm not, but like many of those, like Fair Hiring Act, FICRA and ECOA in credit, like they actually have anti-discrimination laws that are being ignored in the context of algorithms. So when I talk to those guys about what should we be thinking really hard about, it's in the case of existing law, what does it translate to in an algorithm? So it's just sort of like forcing the issue. What do you mean by it can't be racist? The hiring algorithm can't be racist. What does that mean? Translate that into a machine-friendly rule, and then we're going to be getting somewhere. Because right now, we're just like whistling Dixie.
And Gary, before you answer, I just want to reframe it a little differently for you, because your whole book is really building machines we can trust. And we haven't talked about how do you envision doing that, building machines we can trust?
That's exactly what I was going to say. So I don't think we can put the genie back in the bottle, though we can explore that option. I think AI is here to stay. And so what that means to begin with is that we need to build systems that have the same basic level understanding of the world as we do. Right now, what AI does is it tabulates statistics. And that's part of how we understand the world. But we also understand the world in terms of people and objects and their goals and intentions. And so there's a set of hard problems that used to be front and center in AI that has been pushed to the side. People don't have good techniques for it. They have good techniques for the statistics, for collecting a lot of data. There are problems that are very basic, like going back to Kant and the critique of pure reason. How do you represent space and time and causality in machines so that they can understand the basics of why we do the things that we do? Until they understand why we do the things that they do, they're going to act very strangely because they're driven by statistics that are kind of correlated, but they're proxies, to use a word that I really like that's come up tonight. We often have statistics that are proxies of the things that we really care about, which are things like not doing harm to people. And we have a statistical proxy, but we don't have a machine that can compute what harm is relative to what a biological creature is. So we need to work on those problems. They're really hard. We ultimately need a machine learning system. I'm with Pedro on that. But we need a machine learning system that doesn't just traffic in the superficial statistics, but also traffics in correlations between much more abstract ideas about space, time, people, agents, and so forth. And when we get there, we'll have a new generation of AI. And something most people don't know about my book and wouldn't guess, not having read it, except for the few people who read it yesterday.
I read it.
Is that the last chapter is actually very optimistic. So, most of the book is very pessimistic about the current state. We're really calling for a reboot. That's why the title, and we think things need to be changed. But we think if we can achieve that, if we can improve our engineering practices, which we haven't talked about today, build in common sense reasoning, build in values, which we've touched on, then we can build machines that can put together the whole package. And like Danny's saying, they can actually ultimately do a better job than people because they don't suffer from attention or
They don't
egomania.
get really warm
They
in
don't
an
get really
unair-conditioned
well.
room.
They have their temperature constraints too, but the machines ultimately could do a lot better if we restructure them. And so ultimately, I'm optimistic. I think all this will be solved. It's just a question of time.
You have both given us so much to think about. Thank you so much. Please thank
Thank
all our
you.
guests.